My name is Sylvia Thorne, and I have spent 40 years finding things that people want to keep hidden. I worked for the IRS as a forensic accountant, and my job was never about guns or handcuffs or high-speed chases. It was about paper. It was about patience. It was about noticing that a 2 looked a little too much like a 7, or that a decimal point had shifted just enough to hide a fortune. I retired 5 years ago because my husband Elias wanted to travel and see the world and drink wine on the coast of Italy. I thought I had left that life of suspicion behind me, but as I sat in his mahogany study with the rain beating against the dark window pane, I realized that old habits do not die. They just wait. Yesterday, we buried Elias. The service was tasteful and expensive, just like everything else in our lives. There were lilies everywhere, and the scent of them was so thick and cloying that it stuck to the back of my throat like syrup. People came up to me in a long line of black coats and wet umbrellas. They held my hands with their cold, damp palms and told me how sorry they were. They told me Elias was a good man. They told me he was a pillar of the community. They told me I must be devastated. I nodded, and I thanked them, and I played the part of the grieving widow perfectly, because that is what you do when the numbers of your life suddenly stop adding up. But now, the guests are gone. The house is silent, except for the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. It is a deep and heavy sound that vibrates through the floorboards. Most widows would be in bed. Most widows would be weeping into a pillow or taking a sleeping pill to numb the emptiness on the other side of the mattress. But I am not most widows. I am Sylvia Thorne, and when I am stressed, I do not cry. I audit. I sat at Elias's massive oak desk. The leather chair still smelled like him. It was a mixture of expensive tobacco and the sandalwood cologne he ordered from London. It was a comforting smell, but it was also a distraction, so I pushed it aside. In front of me, I had stacked the last 12 months of our bank statements and credit card bills and investment reports. Elias always handled the household accounts. He said I had worked hard enough in my career and I should not have to worry about the bills. It seemed romantic at the time. It seemed like he was taking care of me. Now looking at the stack of paper under the green banker's lamp, I wondered if he was taking care of me or if he was keeping me away from the truth. I adjusted my reading glasses and I picked up the statement from last October. I let my eyes scan the columns of numbers. To most people, a bank statement is just a list of transactions, but to me, it is a story. It tells you where a person went and what they ate and who they loved and what they feared. I saw the charges for our favorite restaurant on Tuesdays. I saw the gas station fill-ups. I saw the subscription to the golf magazine. It was all so normal. It was all so boring. It was the financial footprint of a faithful and predictable husband. I turned the page. November, December, January. My finger traced the lines automatically. My brain was looking for patterns and irregularities without me even telling it to. And then I stopped. It was a check. Check number 409. It was written on February the 14th for exactly $5,000. The payee line just said Medical Services, Inc. I frowned and took a sip of my tea, which had gone cold hours ago. $5,000 was a significant amount, but it was not enough to bankrupt us. We were comfortable. Elias had done well in the import business, but we had excellent health insurance. We had the kind of insurance that covered everything from a broken nail to open heart surgery. Why would he write a personal check for $5,000 for medical services? I pulled the file for March. There it was again. March the 14th. Check number 412. $5,000 to Medical Services, Inc. My heart began to beat a little faster. It was a steady rhythm in my chest, like the ticking of that clock in the hall. I pulled April. I pulled May. I pulled June. Every single month, on the 14th day, there was a check for $5,000. I did the math in my head instantly. 2 years. 24 months. That was $120,000. That was the price of a luxury car, or a small cabin in the woods, or a college education. And it had vanished from our accounts into a company I had never heard of. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain was coming down harder now, washing away the world outside. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I saw an old woman with gray hair, pulled back in a tight bun, and sensible clothes. I saw a woman that people dismissed. They saw a grandmother. They saw a cookie baker. They saw a sweet old lady who needed help crossing the street. They did not see the hunter. Elias had not been sick. He died of a sudden heart attack on the tennis court. He was vibrant and healthy right up until the moment he fell. So what was Medical Services, Inc.? I went back to the desk and opened the bottom drawer where Elias kept his canceled checks. I needed to see the endorsement on the back. I needed to see where the money went. I found the bundle for January and pulled out the check. I flipped it over. The handwriting on the back was jagged and rushed. It did not look like a doctor's signature. It did not look like a business stamp. It was just a name scribbled in blue ink. B. Mercer. I stared at the name. I did not know a B. Mercer. We did not have any friends named Mercer. We did not have any business associates named Mercer. I felt a coldness settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the drafty house. This was not an error. This was not a mistake. This was a pattern. My husband, the man who held my hand and promised to love me until death parted us, had been paying $5,000 a month to a person named B. Mercer. For the first time since the funeral, I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. But they were not tears of grief. They were tears of betrayal. And then, just as quickly as they came, they vanished. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, and I sat up straight in the leather chair. Elias was gone. I could not ask him. I could not yell at him. I could not demand an explanation, but I could follow the money. I had spent 40 years tracking down tax cheats and cartels and embezzlers. I could certainly track down B. Mercer. I reached for my red pen. It was the same pen I used to mark up audits when I found a lie. I circled the name on the back of the check. The grieving widow was gone. The auditor was back on the clock. The sun did not come out the next morning. The sky was a bruised shade of purple and gray, and the rain continued to drum against the slate roof of the house. I had not slept. I had spent the night with the ghost of Elias and the reality of his bank statements. I had lined up the checks on the dining room table like a deck of cards, and they all told the same story. Money out, secrets in. I was in the kitchen, making a pot of strong black coffee when the doorbell rang. It was not a polite ring. It was a long and insistent press that echoed through the empty hallway. It was only 8 in the morning. Visitors at this hour usually meant bad news or a delivery, and I was not expecting either. I tightened the belt of my silk robe and walked to the front door. I checked the peephole. A woman was standing on the porch. She was holding a large black umbrella, and she was shifting her weight from foot to foot as if she was impatient. She looked young, too young to be selling insurance and too well dressed to be a door-to-door evangelist. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The damp morning air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet earth and worms. The woman lowered her umbrella and shook the water off it with a sharp snap. She turned to me and smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. Her eyes were hard and calculating, like pieces of flint. She said, "Mrs. Thorne, I am so sorry to disturb you so early. My name is Beatrix. Beatrix Mercer." The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. B. Mercer. The signature on the back of the checks. The recipient of $120,000 of my husband's money. I felt my blood run cold, but my face remained a mask of polite confusion. I had practiced that face across the table from tax evaders for decades. I asked her what I could do for her. I did not invite her in. I stood in the doorway blocking the entrance with my body. I wanted her to feel unwelcome. She said I was Elias's private nurse. I worked for Medical Services, Inc. I was the one who took care of him during his treatments. I stared at her. Treatments. Elias played tennis 3 times a week. He hiked in the mountains. He drank red wine and ate steak. He was the picture of health until his heart simply stopped. I told her that my husband was not sick. I told her that he had never mentioned a nurse or a treatment or a condition. Beatrix nodded slowly as if she was explaining something to a child. She said Elias was a very private man, Mrs. Thorne. He did not want to worry you. He wanted to protect you. That was the kind of man he was. He hired me to manage his pain and to help him with his therapy when he was traveling for business. It was a good lie. It was plausible. It used Elias's known traits against me. He was protective. He traveled often. But it was still a lie. I knew it in my gut. She took a step forward. She said I just wanted to come by and offer my condolences, and perhaps collect a few personal items I left in the guest cottage. Elias let me stay there sometimes when the treatments ran late. The guest cottage. My stomach twisted. The guest cottage was at the back of the property near the rose garden. Elias used it as a home office when he needed absolute quiet. He told me he was working on sensitive contracts. He told me he needed isolation to focus. I had not invited her in yet, but she moved past me anyway. She collapsed her umbrella and placed it in the bronze stand by the door. She did not ask where the stand was. She knew. She walked into the foyer, and her heels clicked loudly on the marble floor. She looked up at the chandelier, and then she looked at the painting of Elias and me that hung above the staircase. She said, "It is a beautiful house, Sylvia." She used my first name. She said it with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook that Elias always used. She knew exactly which hook was loose and how to balance the coat so it would not fall. I closed the front door and locked it. I wanted to keep the world out, but I realized with a sinking feeling that the danger was already inside. I asked her what kind of items she had left behind. She turned to me and smoothed down her skirt. She was wearing a black dress that fit her a little too tightly for a morning visit. She said just some clothes, some books, maybe a few toiletries. Nothing of value to you, but they mean a lot to me. I looked at her hands. They were manicured and soft. They were not the hands of a nurse. There were no calluses. There was no smell of antiseptic. She smelled of vanilla and ambition. I told her I would have the housekeeper look for her things and send them to her. I told her that now was not a good time. Beatrix laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound. She said, "Oh, Sylvia, there is no need for that. I have a key." She reached into her purse and pulled out a silver key on a simple ring. It was the key to the guest cottage. I recognized it immediately. Elias kept the spare in his safe. Or at least, I thought he did. She said Elias gave it to me, in case of emergencies. She smiled again, and this time I saw the teeth behind it. She was not asking for permission. She was establishing territory. She was telling me that she knew things about my husband that I did not. She was telling me that she had been here right under my nose while I was baking cookies and planning vacations. I looked at the key, and then I looked at her. I realized then that the checks were just the beginning. The $5,000 a month was not for medical services. It was rent. It was a salary. It was the cost of a double life. I told her that she could go to the cottage. I told her to take whatever was hers and leave. She nodded and turned toward the back door that led to the garden. She walked with a confidence that terrified me. She walked like she owned the place. As she disappeared down the hallway, I went back to the kitchen. My hands were shaking. I poured the coffee down the sink. I did not need caffeine. I needed clarity. I needed to see what else she had taken besides my husband's money. I waited until I heard the back door close, and then I went to the phone. I did not call the police. Not yet. The police needed evidence, and right now all I had was a grieving woman with a key. Instead, I went to the library. I needed to find the will. Elias had updated it 2 months ago. He said it was just a formality. He said he was just tidying up the estate. I had signed it without reading the fine print because I trusted him. I pulled the heavy document from the file cabinet. I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages. My eyes scanned the legal jargon. I was looking for her name. I was looking for Mercer. And on the very last page, in a section titled Codicil A, I found it. My breath caught in my throat. It was worse than I thought. It was not just money. It was an invasion. Sat on the floor of the library, surrounded by the smell of old paper and dust. My fingers were cold as they traced the lines of the codicil. Legal language is designed to be dry and unemotional. It strips the passion out of life and reduces everything to assets and liabilities and conditions. But as I read the words on the page, I felt a heat rising in my face that had nothing to do with the fireplace. The paragraph was short. It was brutal in its simplicity. In recognition of her dedicated service and care during my illness, I hereby grant Beatrix Mercer the right of residency in the guest cottage located at 14 Oakwood Drive for a period of no less than 6 months following my death. She shall have full access to the grounds and amenities, and her occupancy shall not be terminated or impeded by the executor of this estate. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. Residency, 6 months, full access. Elias had not just given her money, he had given her a home. My home. He had invited his mistress to live in my backyard while I mourned him. It was a humiliation so profound that for a moment I could not breathe. It was as if he had reached out from the grave and slapped me across the face. I looked at the date next to the signature. It was signed 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, we had hosted a dinner party. Elias had been laughing and drinking wine and telling stories about his college days. He had toasted me. He had called me the love of his life in front of 12 of our closest friends. And the next morning, he had driven to his lawyer's office and signed this paper that allowed another woman to invade my sanctuary. The signature was shaky. It was Elias's name, but the loops were too wide and the slant was wrong. It looked like the handwriting of a man under duress or a man who was heavily medicated. I stood up. My knees cracked. I felt every single one of my 68 years. I walked to the desk and picked up the phone. I dialed the number for Arthur Vance, our family attorney. He had been our lawyer for 30 years. He had been at the funeral yesterday. He had eaten my cucumber sandwiches and patted my hand. He answered on the second ring. His voice was smooth and professional. He asked how I was holding up. I cut him off. I did, just say, not want pleasantries. I wanted answers. I asked him about the codicil. I asked him about Beatrix Mercer. There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long, heavy silence. Then Arthur sighed. He said, "Sylvia, I tried to talk him out of it. I told him it was unorthodox. I told him it would cause you distress. But he was adamant. He said he owed her. He said she had saved him. I asked him what she had saved him from." Arthur hesitated. He said Elias claimed she saved him from despair. He said he was going through a dark time, and she helped him find the light. The light? My husband found the light in the arms of a woman half his age while I was planning our retirement trip to Tuscany. I asked Arthur if the signature looked right to him. I asked if Elias seemed coherent. Arthur said he seemed tired, Sylvia. He seemed desperate, but he was legally competent. If you try to fight this in court, it will get ugly. It will become public record. The press will pick it up. Do you want the whole town discussing Elias's private life? Do you want your friends whispering at the country club? He was using my pride against me. He knew I valued dignity. He knew I hated a scene. I told him I did not care about the country club. I told him I cared about the stranger living in my garden. Arthur said the law is the law, Sylvia. She has a right to be there. If you lock her out, she can sue the estate. She can freeze your assets. She can drag this out for years. My advice is to let the 6 months play out. Let her stay. Ignore her. She will get bored and move on. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I stared at the receiver. Ignore her. He wanted me to ignore the woman who was currently unpacking her bags 50 yards from my kitchen window. I walked to the window that overlooked the backyard. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray. I could see the guest cottage through the trees. The lights were on. I saw a silhouette move past the window. She was already making herself at home. I watched her for a long time. I watched her open the curtains. I watched her put a vase of flowers on the sill. She was marking her territory. She wanted me to see her. She wanted me to know she was there. She thought she had won. She thought she had the law on her side and a grieving widow who would crumble under the weight of scandal. She thought I was weak. But she did not know about the audits. She did not know about the time I spent 3 months digging through the trash of a pharmaceutical executive to prove he was hiding assets in the Cayman Islands. She did not know that I had the patience of a spider. I turned away from the window. I went upstairs to my bedroom. I opened my jewelry box and took out the pearl necklace Elias gave me for our 30th anniversary. I held it in my hand, feeling the cool weight of the pearls. Then I put it back. I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser. Underneath the winter sweaters was a small metal box. I unlocked it. Inside was a digital voice recorder. It was old, but it still worked. I used to use it to dictate notes during my investigations. I put fresh batteries in it. I tested it. My voice sounded calm and steady. I clipped the recorder to the inside of my cardigan pocket. Arthur said I couldn't kick her out. He said the law was on her side. That was fine. I respected the law, but the law had loopholes. The law had conditions, and if Beatrix Mercer broke the law inside my house, then the will would not protect her. I was not going to ignore her. I was going to watch her. I was going to wait for her to make a mistake. And everyone makes a mistake eventually, especially when they get greedy. I went downstairs and put the kettle on. I made a fresh pot of tea. I set a tray with 2 cups. I walked out the back door and down the stone path toward the guest cottage. I was going to welcome my new tenant. I was going to look her in the eye. I was going to let her think she had won. Because the best way to catch a thief is to leave the door unlocked and wait in the dark. The walk to the guest cottage was short, but it felt like crossing a border into enemy territory. The stone path was wet and slippery under my sensible loafers, and the rhododendrons were dripping with rain. I balanced the silver tray with the teapot and the 2 bone china cups. My hands were steady. I breathed in the damp air and reminded myself that I was the predator here. I was the one with the recorder in my pocket. She was just the prey who did not know the hunt had begun. I knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately, as if she had been standing on the other side, waiting for me. Beatrix was wearing a silk kimono that I recognized. It was blue with white cranes embroidered on the back. Elias had brought it back from a trip to Kyoto 3 years ago. He told me he bought it for a client's wife. Seeing it on her body made bile rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. She smiled that sharp, flinty smile. She said, "Sylvia." What a surprise. I was just about to come up to the main house. I held up the tray. I said I thought we got off on the wrong foot. I thought we should have tea. She stepped back and swept her arm wide, inviting me in. The cottage looked different already. She had thrown colorful scarves over the lampshades, creating a dim, sultry lighting. She had lit candles that smelled of heavy musk and vanilla, covering up the smell of old books and leather that I loved. It smelled like a boudoir. It smelled like a trap. We sat on the velvet sofa. I poured the tea. Beatrix did not say thank you. She took the cup and walked to the window, looking out at my garden. She said Elias used to love sitting here. He said it was the only place he could truly breathe. He felt suffocated in the big house Sylvia. All those antiques, all those expectations. She was testing me. She was trying to rewrite my marriage. She wanted me to believe that my husband was a prisoner and she was his liberator. I took a sip of my tea. It was bitter. I had steeped it too long. I said Elias was a complex man. He had many moods. Beatrix turned around. Her eyes flashed. She said I knew his moods better than anyone. I knew what made him happy. She set the cup down on the wooden side table without a coaster. A white ring of heat bloomed instantly on the polished mahogany. She saw me look at it, and she did not move the cup. It was a small act of vandalism, a tiny declaration of war. She said the will says I have full access to the amenities. That means the pool, the library, the kitchen. I plan to use them, Sylvia. I am not going to hide in here like a dirty secret. I nodded. I said you have the right. The law is clear. She looked disappointed. She wanted a fight. She wanted me to scream so she could call the lawyer and claim I was hostile. I was not going to give her the satisfaction. Later that afternoon, the invasion truly began. I was in the living room dusting the mantel when I heard the front door open. Beatrix walked in. She was dressed in yoga pants and a tight tank top. She looked vibrant and young and completely out of place among the grandfather clocks and oil paintings. She walked around the room, touching things. She ran her finger along the back of the sofa. She picked up a crystal figurine. She adjusted a picture frame. She was marking her scent. She was putting her fingerprints on my life. She stopped in front of the display cabinet where I kept my blue willow china. It was my grandmother's set. It was the only thing I had left from my childhood. It was delicate and irreplaceable. Beatrix opened the glass door. She reached in and took out a teacup. She held it up to the light. She said, "This is so old-fashioned." Elias hated this stuff. He said it made the house feel like a museum. He wanted to throw it all out and get something modern, something with life. My heart hammered against my ribs. I said, "Please put that back, Beatrix. It is very fragile." She turned to look at me. She was holding the cup by the rim with 2 fingers. Her grip was loose, careless. She said, "You are so uptight, Sylvia. That is why he was unhappy. You care more about things than people." And then she opened her fingers. It happened in slow motion. The blue and white porcelain fell. It hit the hardwood floor with a sickening crunch. It shattered into a dozen sharp, jagged pieces. The sound echoed in the silence of the room. Beatrix looked down at the shards. She did not look shocked. She did not look sorry. She looked satisfied. She looked up at me and shrugged. She said, "Oops. I guess it was more fragile than I thought. But honestly, Sylvia, it's just a cup. Don't be so dramatic." I stood frozen. I looked at the broken pieces of my grandmother's legacy, scattered at the feet of my husband's mistress. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drag her out of my house by her hair. But I felt the weight of the recorder in my pocket. I forced my breathing to slow down. I forced my hands to unclench. I said, "Accidents happen. I will get the broom." Beatrix laughed. It was a cruel sound. She said, "You do that. I'm going to use the pool." She walked past me, bumping my shoulder as she went. She walked out the back door, leaving the mess for me to clean up. I knelt down on the floor. I picked up a shard of the blue china. It was sharp enough to cut skin. I realized then that this was not just about residence. Beatrix did not just want to live here. She wanted to erase me. She wanted to break everything I loved until I was the one who left. She was trying to drive me out of my own home, but she had made a mistake. She thought breaking the cup would break my spirit. She was wrong. I looked at the shard in my hand. It was not a tragedy. It was evidence. I carefully gathered the pieces. I did not throw them away. I put them in a plastic bag and I labeled it with the date and the time. Broken antique property. Value $300. Malicious destruction. I put the bag in my safe. Then I went to the kitchen and I opened the drawer where I kept the spare keys. I took out the key to the library. If she wanted a war, she would get one. But I would not fight with smashed cups and insults. I would fight with paper. I would fight with facts. Tonight, while she slept in the guest cottage, I was going to do what I did best. I was going to audit her life. I was going to find out who Beatrix Mercer really was, and I was going to find the leverage I needed to evict her. The invasion had started, but the counterattack began tonight. Sleep is a luxury I cannot afford when there is a fox in the hen house. It was 2 a.m, and the house was settling with those familiar groans and creaks that used to comfort me but now sounded like warnings. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence that amplified every sound. I heard it at 2:15. It was a soft thud, followed by the distinct squeak of a floorboard. I knew that squeak. It was the third plank from the left in the library hallway. Elias used to step over it carefully when he came up late at night so he would not wake me. Whoever was down there did not know the geography of the house. I did not turn on the bedside lamp. I did not panic. I slid out of bed and put on my slippers. I grabbed the heavy brass flashlight I kept in the nightstand, but I did not turn it on. I knew this house in the dark better than Beatrix Mercer knew it in the light. I moved to the landing and looked over the railing. A faint beam of light was dancing across the foyer floor, spilling out from the open library doors. She was not just getting a glass of water. She was hunting. I walked down the stairs, hugging the wall to stay in the shadows. My heart was a slow, steady drumbeat. I was not afraid of her physically. Beatrix relied on psychological violence and social manipulation. She was a bully, not a thug. But seeing the light flicker in my husband's sanctuary made anger boil in my veins. I reached the library doorway and stopped. Beatrix was there. She was wearing black pajamas, and she was barefoot. She held a small penlight in her mouth, and she was running her hands along the mahogany bookshelves. She was not looking at the titles. She was pulling books out, shaking them, and shoving them back. She was running her fingers along the wood paneling, tapping gently every few inches. Tap, tap, tap. She was looking for a hollow space. She was looking for a hidden compartment. I watched her for a full minute. She moved with a desperate, frantic energy. She climbed the rolling ladder to reach the high shelves. She felt behind the bust of Caesar. She lifted the corners of the Persian rug. This was not the behavior of a grieving mistress wanting to be close to her lover's memory. This was a search for contraband. I stepped into the room and flipped the light switch. The sudden brightness was blinding. Beatrix gasped and nearly fell off the ladder. The penlight clattered to the floor. She spun around, her eyes wide and wild like a deer caught in headlights. For a second, the mask slipped, and I saw pure panic on her face. Then just as quickly, the mask slid back into place. She climbed down from the ladder, smoothing her pajamas. She forced a laugh. It sounded breathless and fake. She said, "Sylvia, you scared me half to death." I stood my ground, my arms crossed over my chest. I said, "What are you doing, Beatrix? It is 2 a.m. She gestured vaguely at the floor. She said I lost an earring, one of the diamond studs Elias gave me. I think it fell out when I was here earlier. I couldn't sleep worrying about it. I looked at the floor. The rug was undisturbed. I looked at the shelves where she had been tapping. I said, "You think your earring fell behind the Encyclopedia Britannica on the top shelf. You think it rolled under the wainscoting on the wall." Her eyes narrowed. She knew I didn't believe her. She didn't care. She said I was looking everywhere, Sylvia. Diamonds bounce. You know how it is. She walked toward me, stopping just inches away. She smelled of sweat and nervous energy. She said, "I am sorry if I woke you. I will look again in the morning." She tried to brush past me, but I didn't move. I blocked her path. I said, "Tell me, Beatrix. What is it really? Did Elias leave you something else? Something he didn't put in the will?" She froze. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought she was going to hit me. The air between us crackled with tension. She leaned in close. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She said, "Elias promised me security, Sylvia. Real security. Not just 6 months in a cottage. He left something for me, something that belongs to me, and I'm going to find it. And when I do, I will never have to worry about money or old women or auditors ever again." She stepped back and smiled that cruel smile. She said, "Go back to bed, Sylvia. You look tired." She walked out of the library, leaving me standing alone in the bright, harsh light. I waited until I heard the front door close and the lock click. Then I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I walked to the bookshelf where she had been searching. I ran my hand over the wood. It was solid. Beatrix had made a mistake. In her arrogance, she had revealed her hand. She wasn't just here to torment me. She was here on a treasure hunt. Elias had hidden something. A document. A key. A cache of cash. Something valuable enough to make a young woman seduce an old man and then claw her way into his widow's house. I looked around the room. There were thousands of books. There were dozens of drawers. There were loose floorboards and hollow table legs. Beatrix knew the what, but she clearly did not know the where. That gave me an advantage. I knew Elias. I knew how his mind worked. He loved puzzles. He loved symmetry. He was a creature of habit. If he hid something, he would not hide it randomly behind a book. He would hide it somewhere that meant something. I sat down in his leather chair. I closed my eyes. I tried to think like him. Security, money, a promise. What had she said? Real security. I looked at the financial records still stacked on the desk. The $5,000 a month was hush money. But hush money for what? My eyes drifted to the filing cabinet. I had looked at the bank statements. I had looked at the credit card bills, but I had not looked at the business ledgers. The old import records from before he retired. If Beatrix was looking for a physical object, maybe she was looking in the wrong place. Maybe the treasure wasn't a bar of gold. Maybe it was information. I turned off the main light and turned on the desk lamp. I was not going back to bed. The hunt had changed. It was no longer just about getting her out of my house. It was a race. I had to find what Elias had hidden before she did. Because if she found it first, I had a terrible feeling that losing my house would be the least of my problems. I pulled a fresh notepad from the drawer. I wrote down one word: Galloway. I didn't know why that name popped into my head. It was just a flicker of a memory. Something Elias had said weeks ago in his sleep. Or maybe it was something I had seen in the papers. I needed to find the breadcrumbs, and I needed to do it now. The sun had begun to rise. It was a pale, watery light that filtered through the library curtains and made the dust motes dance in the air. I had not slept. My eyes felt gritty and dry, like I had been walking through a sandstorm. But my mind was vibrating with that peculiar high frequency that only comes when the pieces of a puzzle start to snap together. Beatrix was asleep in the guest cottage. I could see the dark windows from my desk. She was dreaming of diamonds and security. I was awake, and I was dissecting a ghost. I had spent the last 4 hours tearing apart the identity of Medical Services, Inc. It was exactly what I expected. It was a shell, a paper construct designed to absorb money and tell no tales. I used my old laptop and logged into the state business registry. It was amazing what you could find if you knew where to look and if you still remembered the passwords from your old life at the IRS. Medical Services, Inc. was registered in Delaware 3 years ago. The registered agent was a generic legal firm that handled thousands of companies. The address was a post office box in a strip mall in Dover. It had no employees. It had no website. It had no medical license. It was a black hole. But every black hole has a gravitational pull. You just have to find what is orbiting it. I went back to the physical files. Elias was a creature of habit, but he was also a man of vanity. He kept everything. He kept the receipt for his first suit. He kept the ticket stub from the opera where we met. If he created this company, he would have kept the paperwork. He would have hidden it, but he would not have destroyed it. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. This was the drawer marked miscellaneous. It was the junk drawer of his financial life. It was full of warranties for appliances we no longer owned and instruction manuals for digital cameras from 10 years ago. It was the perfect place to hide a needle in a haystack because nobody ever looks in the haystack. I sat cross-legged on the Persian rug and began to sift. I moved aside a warranty for a lawnmower. I moved aside a manual for a blender. My hands moved rhythmically. Pick up, scan, discard. Pick up, scan, discard. And then I found it. It was a small yellow invoice stapled to the back of an instruction manual for a humidifier. It was not for the humidifier. It was a handwritten note on the stationery of a company called Galloway Horology. The date was from 5 years ago. The handwriting was elegant and looped. To Mr. Thorne. Invoice for restoration and modification. Custom locking mechanism installed as requested. Calibration complete. Total due $4,000. I held the paper up to the light. Galloway Horology. Horology is the study of time. It is the science of clocks. Why would Elias hide a receipt for clock repair? We had several clocks in the house. He loved them. He loved the order of them. He loved the way they chopped eternity into manageable seconds. There was nothing secret about fixing a clock, unless the repair was not the point. I read the note again. Custom locking mechanism installed as requested. My pulse quickened. You do not install a locking mechanism on a clock unless you plan to put something inside it. I looked at the word, Galloway, again. It had been nagging at me since I saw the check endorsements. I went back to the stack of checks on the desk. I pulled the ones made out to Medical Services, Inc. I looked at the memo lines. Elias usually left them blank, but on the very first check, the one from 2 years ago, he had written a single letter in the corner. Gee, I had thought it was a doodle. I had thought it was a pen scratch. But now, looking at the invoice, I realized it was a reference. I went back to the computer. I typed in Galloway Horology. The search results were sparse. It was a small family business in upstate New York. They specialized in antique restoration. They were known for their discretion and their intricate woodwork. I sat back in the leather chair and closed my eyes. I tried to build the timeline in my head. 5 years ago, Elias hires a clockmaker to install a secret lock on one of our clocks. 3 years ago, he creates a shell company called Medical Services, Inc. 2 years ago, he starts siphoning money into that company and paying Beatrix. The money was the flow. The shell company was the vehicle. But the clock was the vault. Beatrix was tearing the library apart looking for a safe or a ledger or a bag of cash. She was looking for a conventional hiding spot. She was looking for a wall safe behind a tall painting. But Elias was smarter than that. He knew that the best place to hide something is in plain sight. He hid his secret inside the very thing that announced its presence every single hour. I stood up. The house was quiet. The morning light was getting stronger. I walked out of the library and into the main hallway. The floorboards were cold under my feet. I walked past the dining room. I walked past the staircase, and there it stood, the grandfather clock. It was a massive thing made of dark cherry wood. It stood nearly 8 feet tall. It had a brass pendulum that swung back and forth with a hypnotic rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It had been in the hallway for as long as we had lived in this house. Elias loved it. He wound it every Sunday morning like a religious ritual. He would open the glass case and pull the chains and listen to the weights reset. He never let me touch it. He said it was temperamental. He said it needed a specific touch. I stood in front of the clock. I looked at the face. The Roman numerals were painted in gold leaf. The hands were delicate black filigree. I looked down at the base of the clock. It was a heavy wooden box that housed the swinging pendulum. Somewhere inside, that wood was a modification. Somewhere inside that wood was the answer to why my husband had betrayed me and what Beatrix Mercer was so desperate to find. I did not touch it yet. Beatrix was awake now. I could hear the faint sound of the shower running in the guest cottage. The water pipes in the old house always sang when they were in use. I could not risk her walking in while I was exploring. I needed to wait. I needed her to leave, but I knew, I felt it in my bones. The breadcrumbs didn't lead to a bank in the Cayman Islands. They led to the hallway of my own home. I went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. I needed to look normal. I needed to be the grieving widow drinking her tea. But as I watched the steam rise from the spout, I smiled. It was a cold, hard smile. Beatrix was looking for a payday. I was looking for the truth, and I was standing right next to it. Beatrix left the house at 10 o'clock sharp. She did not tell me where she was going, but she was dressed for battle in a sharp white blazer and sunglasses that covered half her face. I watched from the kitchen window as she climbed into her red convertible and reversed out of the driveway with a spray of gravel. She drove fast. She drove like a woman who was running out of time. I waited until the sound of her engine had faded completely into the distance. I waited another 5 minutes just to be sure she had not forgotten her phone or her lipstick. Then I locked the front door and engaged the deadbolt. I was alone. I walked into the hallway. The house was silent except for the rhythmic heartbeat of the grandfather clock. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It stood there like a sentinel in the shadows, tall and imposing, and smelling of lemon oil and old wood. I stood before it and placed my hand on the glass door of the pendulum case. The glass was cool to the touch. I looked at the face of the clock. It was 10:15. The hands were moving relentlessly forward, indifferent to my heartbreak and my investigation. Elias had loved this clock. He used to say that time was the only currency that really mattered because you could never earn more of it. He was right, and right now I was spending my currency to find out just how much he had stolen from me. I opened the glass door. The latch gave a soft click. Inside, the heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth in a mesmerizing arc. I reached in and stopped it. I held the cold metal disc in my hand and felt the vibration of the mechanism shudder and die. The ticking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and sudden. It felt like the house was holding its breath. I knelt down on the hard floor. My knees protested, but I ignored them. I needed to see the floor of the clock case. It looked like solid mahogany. It was smooth and polished and dark. To the naked eye, it was just a piece of wood. But I knew better. I knew about the invoice. I knew about the custom locking mechanism. I ran my fingers along the edges where the floor met the walls of the clock. I pressed. I pulled. I tapped. Nothing moved. It was solid. I sat back on my heels and frowned. Elias was not a complicated man, but he enjoyed gadgets. He enjoyed the feeling of being clever. He would not make it impossible. He would make it intuitive for himself. I thought about the invoice again. Galloway horology, restoration and modification. I looked up at the weights. There were 3 brass weights hanging on chains. They controlled the time and the chimes. Elias wound them every Sunday. He always pulled the center chain first, then the left, then the right. I reached up and pulled the center chain. The ratchet clicked loudly. Nothing happened. I pulled the left chain. Click, click, click. Nothing. I pulled the right chain. As the weight rose, I heard a distinct metallic thunk from the bottom of the case. It was the sound of a latch releasing. I looked down. A section of the floor inside the clock had popped up about half an inch. It was a false bottom. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached in with trembling fingers and pried the wooden panel up. It lifted away easily, revealing a shallow compartment lined with black velvet. And there it was. It was not a stack of gold bars. It was not a pile of cash. It was a simple black leather notebook about the size of a paperback novel. I lifted it out. It was heavy for its size. The leather was worn and soft from use. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Elias's. It was unmistakable, but these were not the notes of an importer. These were the records of a ghost. Page after page was filled with columns of numbers and dates and names I did not recognize. There were routing numbers for banks in Zurich and the Cayman Islands. There were lists of shell companies. There were login codes and passwords. I turned to the back of the book. There was a final entry dated 2 weeks before he died. Balance, $2,400,000. I let out a breath that sounded like a sob. $2 million. He had over $2 million hidden away in offshore accounts while I was clipping coupons and checking the price of milk. And then I saw the note at the very bottom of the page. Access key. BM. Knows the phrase. BM. Beatrix Mercer. The pieces slammed together in my mind with the force of a car crash. Elias had given her the key to his fortune, but he had not told her where the door was. She knew the phrase. She knew the password to the accounts. But she did not have the account numbers. She did not have the routing codes. Those were in this book. She needed the book to get the money. And she knew it was in the house. That was why she was tearing up the library. That was why she was tapping on the walls. She knew the ledger existed, but she did not know about the clock. I held the book against my chest. This was it. This was the leverage. This was the weapon. If I gave this to the police, Elias's reputation would be destroyed. The assets would be frozen. The IRS would descend on the estate like vultures. I would spend the rest of my life in court battles and depositions. But if I let Beatrix find it, she would disappear with $2 million and leave me with the wreckage. I heard the sound of a car engine in the driveway. Panic flared in my chest. She was back. She was early. I looked at the clock. The false bottom was still open. The pendulum was still. I shoved the panel back into place. I heard it click shut. I restarted the pendulum, giving it a gentle push. The ticking resumed. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I closed the glass door. I stood up, clutching the black notebook. I had seconds. I looked around the hallway. I could not run upstairs. She would see me on the landing. I could not go into the kitchen. She would see me through the window. I slipped into the coat closet under the stairs just as the front door opened. I pressed myself back among the winter coats and the smell of wool and mothballs. Through the crack in the door, I saw Beatrix walk in. She looked frustrated. She threw her keys onto the entry table. She stopped. She tilted her head. She looked at the clock. She walked over to it. She stood right where I had been standing 10 seconds ago. She put her hand on the wood. She said, "I know you are in here somewhere." She was talking to the money. She turned and walked into the living room. I waited until her footsteps faded. I slipped out of the closet and hurried to the kitchen, hiding the notebook under my cardigan. I had the asset, but now I had a new problem. I couldn't keep it. If she found it on me, she would take it. She was younger and stronger and desperate. I needed to hide it again. But I needed to hide it somewhere she would never look. And I needed to make sure that when she finally made her move, she walked right into a trap. I looked at the notebook in my hand. It looked like any other notebook. An idea began to form in my mind. It was dangerous. It was risky. But it was the only way to end this. I needed a decoy. I retreated to the kitchen with the real ledger tucked tight against my ribs under my wool cardigan. My heart was fluttering like a trapped bird, but my hands were steady. I could hear Beatrix upstairs in the guest room. She was walking back and forth with heavy, angry steps. She was frustrated. She was running out of patience. And a person who is out of patience is a person who makes mistakes. I needed to secure the asset. I looked around my kitchen. It was a kingdom of copper pots and dried herbs and orderly spice racks. It was the last place a woman like Beatrix would ever look because it was a place of work. She did not cook. She did not bake. To her, a kitchen was just a room where servants made martinis. I went to the pantry and pulled down the large ceramic jar labeled flour. It was heavy and white with a blue rim. I emptied the top layer of flour into a bowl. I wrapped the black leather notebook in a gallon-sized freezer bag and pressed the air out. Then I buried it deep in the white powder. I poured the rest of the flour back on top and smoothed it over. It was a cliché hiding spot. It was something a grandmother would do, and that was exactly why it would work. Beatrix saw me as a grandmother. She did not see me as a threat. Now came the hard part. I needed a twin. I went to the junk drawer by the refrigerator. Elias had a habit of buying notebooks in bulk. He liked the small black moleskin ones that fit in a jacket pocket. He bought them by the dozen. I dug past the rubber bands and the loose batteries and found one that was unused. It was the exact same size and shape as the Galloway ledger. The leather was a little newer and a little stiffer, but in the dark, or in a panic, it would pass. I sat at the kitchen table and took out my favorite fountain pen. I needed to create a fantasy. I needed to create a document that looked worth stealing. I opened the fresh notebook and began to write. I did not write random gibberish. I was a forensic accountant. I knew what financial crimes looked like on paper. I created a column of dates going back 5 years. I invented shell companies with names that sounded important. Apex Holdings, Meridian Global, Blue Water Trust. I listed amounts that would make anyone's mouth water. 50,000, 100,000, 500,000. I filled 10 pages with intricate nonsense. I made sure my handwriting looked rushed and secretive, just like Elias's. I smudged the ink in a few places. I dogged the corners of the pages to make them look worn. When I was finished, I closed the book. It looked legitimate. It looked like the key to a kingdom. I stood up and walked to the hallway mirror. I checked my face. I needed to look flustered. I needed to look like a woman who was trying to hide a secret and failing. I pulled a few strands of hair loose from my bun. I pinched my cheeks to make them look flushed. I took the decoy notebook in my hand. I did not hide it this time. I held it openly. I walked into the living room. I knew Beatrix was upstairs, but the acoustics in this house were excellent. If I made a noise, she would hear it. I opened the drawer of the antique secretary desk. It was a creaky drawer. I opened it slowly, and then I let it snap shut with a loud bang. Immediately, the footsteps upstairs stopped. I waited. I opened the drawer again. I rustled some papers. I hummed a nervous little tune. I heard the soft tread of feet on the stairs. She was coming. I quickly placed the decoy notebook inside the drawer. I turned the small brass key in the lock. I pulled on the handle to make sure it was secure. Then I slipped the key into the pocket of my skirt. I turned around and pretended to jump. Beatrix was standing in the doorway. She was watching me with eyes that were sharp and hungry. She had seen me at the desk. She had seen me lock the drawer. She had seen the flash of the black notebook. I put a hand to my chest and stammered. I said, "Oh, Beatrix, I did not hear you come down." She walked into the room. She was moving like a cat now, predatory and smooth. She said, "What are you doing, Sylvia? You look guilty." I took a step back, putting my body between her ear and the desk. I said, "I am just organizing some papers, just tidying up." She looked at the desk. She looked at the locked drawer. Then she looked at my pocket where the key was outlined against the fabric. She smiled. It was a terrifying smile because it was full of triumph. She thought she had caught me. She thought I was the one hiding the money to keep it from her. She said, "You know, Sylvia, hiding assets from the beneficiary of a will is a crime. If Elias left something for me, you have to give it to me." I lifted my chin. I played the part of the stubborn old widow. I said, "This is my house, Beatrix. Everything in it belongs to me. Elias made his choices, and I am making mine." She laughed. She walked closer until she was invading my personal space. I could smell her expensive perfume. She said, "We will see about that. She did not try to take the key. She did not try to force the drawer open. Not while I was standing there. That would be assault. That would be robbery. Beatrix was smarter than that. She wanted to do this when I wasn't looking. She turned and walked into the kitchen. I heard her open the refrigerator. She was acting casual. She was waiting for me to leave. I stayed in the living room for another minute, guarding the desk. Then I made a show of checking my watch. I said I have to go to the market. We are out of milk. I saw her peek her head out of the kitchen. She nodded. She said, "Take your time, Sylvia. Drive safe." I grabbed my purse. I patted my pocket to make sure the key was still there. I walked to the front door and opened it. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me. I locked it loudly. I walked to my car and got in. I started the engine and backed out of the driveway. I drove down the street until I was out of sight. Then I pulled over and parked behind a large oak tree. I turned off the engine. I was not going to the market. I was going to wait. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened the app that connected to the security camera I had installed in the living room 3 years ago to watch the dog when we were at work. Elias had forgotten it was there. I was betting Beatrix didn't know about it either. I watched the small screen. The living room was empty. The grandfather clock ticked in the background. The secretary desk stood in the corner. 2 minutes passed. Then Beatrix walked into the frame. She was holding a letter opener. It was a long, sharp silver blade. She walked straight to the desk. She didn't hesitate. She jammed the tip of the letter opener into the lock of the drawer. She was not just looking. She was breaking and entering. I pressed the record button on my phone. The trap was sprung. Now I just had to wait for the snap. I sat in my car behind the massive oak tree 3 blocks away and watched the tiny screen of my phone with a cold detachment that frightened me. The video feed was grainy but clear enough. I saw Beatrix pry the tip of the silver letter opener into the soft wood of the antique secretary desk. I saw the mahogany splinter and give way. It was a violent act. It was not just about opening a drawer. It was about violating a boundary. She wrenched the drawer open, and the sound of the wood cracking was audible even through the tiny microphone. She reached in and grabbed the black notebook. Her face lit up with a greedy hunger that made her beautiful features look distorted and ugly. She flipped through the pages I had forged. She saw the columns of fake numbers and the lists of imaginary shell companies, and she smiled. It was the smile of a predator who has finally caught the rabbit. She slipped the notebook into the waistband of her yoga pants and pulled her shirt down to cover it. She patted the spot like she was checking for a weapon. She thought she had won. She thought she held $2 million against her hip. I closed the app and put the phone in my purse. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I let my shoulders slump forward. I rubbed my eyes until they were red and irritated. I pulled a few more strands of hair loose so I looked disheveled. I needed to look like a woman who was falling apart. I needed to be the victim she wanted me to be. I started the car and drove back to the house. I pulled into the driveway and parked slowly. I walked to the front door with a heavy, shuffling step. I unlocked the door and stepped into the foyer. The house felt different. The air was charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. Beatrix was not hiding anymore. She was sitting in the living room in Elias's favorite armchair with her legs crossed. She had opened a bottle of his expensive Bordeaux, and she was drinking it out of a crystal goblet. She did not look up when I entered. She just swirled the wine in the glass and watched the red liquid coat the sides. I walked into the room and stopped. I clutched my purse to my chest like a shield. I looked at the desk. The drawer was hanging open. The wood was jagged and broken. I gasped. I put a hand to my mouth. I said, "Beatrix, what happened?" What did you do to the desk?" She took a slow sip of wine and looked at me over the rim of the glass. Her eyes were hard and bright. She did not apologize. She did not make up a lie about an accident or a burglar. She just laughed. She said, "Stop acting, Sylvia. We both know what was in there." She stood up and walked toward me. She was taller than me, and she used her height to intimidate. She loomed over me, forcing me to step back until I was pressed against the wall. She said, "Did you really think you could hide it from me? Did you think you could keep what is mine?" I made my voice tremble. I said, "I don't know what you are talking about. Please, you are scaring me." She leaned in close. I could smell the wine on her breath mixed with her vanilla perfume. It was a sickly sweet combination. She said, "I found the ledger, Sylvia. I found the accounts. Elias didn't leave you anything but this dusty old museum of a house. The real money, the cash, it belongs to me." I looked at her with wide, watery eyes. I let a tear spill over and run down my cheek. I said, "There is no money. Elias spent everything on the treatments. He told me he was broke." Beatrix laughed again. It was a harsh barking sound. She reached under her shirt and patted the hidden notebook. She said, "You are a pathetic old woman. You are senile. You don't even know what was going on under your own roof. Elias laughed at you. He told me how boring you were. He told me how you obsessed over coupons and tax returns while he was living a real life with me." Her words were meant to cut. They were meant to bleed me dry. And a week ago, they might have destroyed me. But today, they just fueled the cold fire in my gut. Every insult was a confession. Every threat was being recorded on the device in my pocket. She stepped back and took another drink of wine. She spilled a little on the Persian rug and didn't even notice. She said, "I am going to take this money, Sylvia. I am going to empty those accounts, and then I am going to sue the estate for emotional distress. I am going to take this house, and I am going to bulldoze it. I am going to erase every trace of you." I slumped against the wall. I let my purse slide from my fingers to the floor. I looked like a woman who had been beaten. I said, "Please, Beatrix, this is my home. It is all I have." She sneered. She said, "You belong in a nursing home, Sylvia. You are confused. You are weak. You can't even protect a wooden drawer, let alone a fortune." She turned her back on me and walked to the window. She looked out at the garden as if she was surveying her kingdom. She said, "I am going to go out tonight. I am going to celebrate. When I come back, I expect you to stay out of my way." She was arrogant. She was drunk on power and red wine. She had the decoy book, and she thought it was the end of the story. But she had not looked closely at the last page of my forgery. She had not seen the note I wrote at the bottom of the fake ledger. Authentication required. Mechanical key located in the timekeeper. She hadn't read it yet, but she would. Later tonight, when she tried to access the fake accounts and realized she needed one more piece of the puzzle, she would read every single word. And when she read timekeeper, she would think of only one thing. I looked at the grandfather clock standing in the hall behind me. The pendulum swung back and forth. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I wiped the tear from my cheek. My hand was steady. I said quietly, so she almost couldn't hear me. I said, "You are right, Beatrix. I am old. I am confused. I am just going to tidy up and go to bed." She waved her hand dismissively without turning around. She said, "Go away, Sylvia. You are boring me." I picked up my purse. I walked into the kitchen. I felt the weight of the real ledger hidden in the flour jar. I felt the weight of the recorder in my pocket. Beatrix thought she was the hunter. She thought she had cornered the prey. but she didn't know that the prey was leading her toward a cliff. I needed to make sure she went for the clock. I needed to make sure she broke it. I needed her to destroy the one thing Elias loved almost as much as his money. I made a cup of tea. My hands were not shaking anymore. Tomorrow, I would spring the trap. But tonight, I had to plant the final seed. I had to make her desperate. I walked back into the living room. Beatrix was still standing by the window. I cleared my throat. I said, "Beatrix, there is one thing." She turned around, annoyed. She said, "What now?" I said, "I know you hate the old things in this house. You broke the cup. You broke the desk. I don't want anything else to be destroyed." I paused. I looked at the grandfather clock. I said so. I called the charity shop. They are coming tomorrow morning to take the grandfather clock away. I am donating it. Beatrix froze. Her eyes darted to the clock. I saw the gears turn in her head. She didn't know about the note yet, but the seed was planted. The clock was leaving. If there was anything else hidden, she had 12 hours to find it. She narrowed her eyes. She said, "Why would you do that?" Elias loved that clock. I shrugged. I said, "It is too loud. The ticking keeps me awake." I turned and walked up the stairs, leaving her alone with the wine and the lies and the clock that was counting down the minutes to her destruction. The darkness in the house was absolute. I had turned off every light and pulled every curtain. I sat in the armchair in the shadows of the upstairs landing. I was wearing my dark wool coat and my sturdy walking shoes. My purse was on my lap, and my phone was in my hand. The screen was dim, but the numbers 911 were already typed into the keypad. My thumb hovered over the green call button. It was 3 in the morning. This is the hour when the world is weakest. It is the hour when resolve crumbles and desperation takes over. I knew Beatrix was awake. I knew she had opened the decoy ledger. I pictured her sitting in that cottage under the yellow light of the lamp, reading the rows of fake numbers. I pictured the moment her eyes hit the bottom of the page. Authentication required. Mechanical key located in the timekeeper. She would have stared at those words. She would have remembered the grandfather clock. And then she would have remembered my voice saying, "I am donating it tomorrow morning." Panic is a powerful motivator. It overrides logic. It overrides caution. It turns a greedy woman into a reckless one. I had prepared the stage. Before I came upstairs, I had done something I had never done in 40 years of living in this house. I had engaged the heavy brass slide bolts on the inside of the front and back doors. Beatrix had a key to the deadbolt, but she could not open a slide bolt from the outside. If she wanted to get in, she would have to break in. She would have to cross the line from an unwanted house guest to a criminal intruder. I heard the gravel crunch outside. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like footsteps trying to be quiet and failing. I looked at the luminous dial of my watch. 3:14. I heard the front door handle jiggle. Then I heard the metallic scratch of her key sliding into the lock. She turned it. The deadbolt clicked open. She pushed. The door did not move. The brass slide bolt held firm. I heard a muffled curse. She pushed again, harder this time. The wood groaned, but the door held. She was locked out. A rational person would wait until morning. A rational person would call the lawyer. But Beatrix was not rational. She was looking at a fortune that was about to vanish in a charity truck at dawn. I heard her footsteps move away from the front door. She was circling the house. She was looking for a weakness. I stood up and moved silently to the edge of the railing. I could see the foyer below. The grandfather clock stood tall and silent in the gloom. It was the prize. It was the vault. I heard a sound from the living room. It was the sharp, clear sound of glass breaking. She had gone to the French doors that led to the garden. She had smashed a pane. My thumb pressed the call button on my phone. The operator answered on the first ring. Her voice was calm and professional. I whispered into the phone. I said, "My name is Sylvia Thorne. I am at 14 Oakwood Drive. There is someone breaking into my house. I am an old woman, and I am alone. Please hurry." The operator told me to stay on the line. She told me officers were dispatched. She told me to lock myself in a room. I did not lock myself in a room. I set the phone down on the carpet with the line still open so the operator could hear everything. I wanted a witness. I looked down into the foyer. A shadow moved from the living room into the hallway. It was Beatrix. She was wearing dark clothes, but I could see the glint of metal in her hand. She was carrying a crowbar. She must have taken it from the tool shed on her way in. She walked straight to the clock. She did not look around. She did not check for me. She had tunnel vision. She stood before the timekeeper. Her breathing was ragged and loud in the silent house. She reached out and touched the glass door of the pendulum case. She hissed. She said, "Damn you, Sylvia. You almost cost me everything." She thought the mechanical key was inside. She thought she needed a physical object to unlock the digital fortune I had invented. She wedged the tip of the crowbar between the wood of the door and the frame of the clock. This was it. This was the destruction of property. This was the felony. I spoke. My voice rang out from the top of the stairs, clear and authoritative. It was not the voice of a grandmother. It was the voice of the auditor. I said, "Step away from the clock, Beatrix." She spun around. She looked up at me. In the darkness, her face was a pale blur, but I could feel the hatred radiating off her. She raised the crowbar like a weapon. She said, "Give me the key, Sylvia. I know it is in there." I read the ledger. I know about the authentication. I walked down 3 steps. I held the banister tight. I said, "There is no key, Beatrix. There is no money in the clock. It is just wood and gears. You are breaking into my home for a phantom." She laughed. It was a manic sound. She said, "You are lying. You have always lied to me. You tried to hide it in the flour. You tried to donate the clock. You want it all for yourself." She turned back to the clock. She raised the crowbar high above her head. I shouted. I said, "Stop! That clock is worth more than you are." She didn't listen. She swung the iron bar with all her strength. The sound was deafening. The glass shattered. The wood splintered. The heavy crowbar smashed into the delicate face of the clock. The hands were bent. The gold leaf was gouged. The clock groaned. The weights inside crashed down with a discordant clang. The ticking stopped forever. Beatrix reached into the broken remains. She didn't care about the glass cutting her hands. She ripped the pendulum out. She tore at the wooden casing. She was looking for a secret compartment. She was looking for the key. She found nothing. She ripped the false bottom out, the one I had already emptied. It was empty. She screamed. It was a primal scream of rage and frustration. She turned and threw the crowbar across the room. It hit the wall and gouged the plaster. She looked up at me again. Her chest was heaving. Blood was dripping from her hand onto the white marble floor. She said, "Where is it? Where is the key?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the real ledger, the one I had taken from the clock yesterday. I held it up. I said, "There is no key, Beatrix. Just a book. and you are never going to touch it." She took a step toward the stairs. She was going to come up. She was going to take it by force. But then the room was flooded with blue and red light. The sirens had been silent as they approached, but now they wailed, cut through the night air. Tires screeched in the driveway. Car doors slammed. I saw the realization wash over her face. She looked at the door. She looked at the broken window. She looked at the crowbar lying on the floor. She looked at me. I smiled. It was a cold, hard smile. I said, "I told you, Beatrix. I am not just a widow. I am the one who checks the books. And your audit is over." The front door burst open as the police rammed it. The trap had snapped shut. The foyer of my house was no longer a sanctuary of silence and history. It was a chaotic theater of flashing blue and red lights that swept across the walls and made the shadows dance like frantic ghosts. The front door was splintered where the police had forced it open, and 3 uniformed officers were shouting commands that overlapped into a wall of noise. I stood on the staircase looking down at the scene with the detached calm of someone watching a play from the balcony. I had written the script, and now I was watching the final act. Beatrix was on her knees, surrounded by the wreckage of the grandfather clock. The officer had his weapon drawn, but pointed low. He was yelling at her to put her hands behind her head. She looked small and broken amidst the shards of glass and the twisted brass of the pendulum. The crowbar lay a few feet away like a discarded prop. She was sobbing now, but they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of fury. She was a woman who had been promised a kingdom and had wound up in a cage. One of the officers moved in and pulled her arms back. I heard the distinct metallic click of handcuffs. It was a sound I had never heard in my own home, and it sent a shiver down my spine. Beatrix struggled. She twisted her body and screamed at them. She screamed that she lived there. She screamed that I was a thief. She screamed that I had stolen her inheritance. I walked down the rest of the stairs. My legs felt heavy, but I kept my back straight. A second officer approached me. He was young, with a kind face that was currently tight with tension. He asked if I was injured. He asked if there was anyone else in the house. I told him I was fine. I told him I was the homeowner and that the woman on the floor was a guest who had broken in after locking herself out. I told him she had destroyed my property and threatened me with a weapon. Beatrix looked up at me. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in black streaks. She looked like a nightmare version of the glamorous woman who had arrived on my doorstep a week ago. She shouted, "Sylvia, tell them. Tell them about the ledger. Tell them about the money Elias hid. You are setting me up." The officer looked at me. He looked at the broken clock. He looked at the crowbar. I looked at Beatrix and shook my head slowly. I said, "There is no money, Beatrix. There is only a sad old woman and a greedy nurse who couldn't wait 6 months. You destroyed the only thing of value in this hall because you believed a fairy tale." The officer pulled Beatrix to her feet. She stumbled. She was barefoot and her feet were bleeding from the glass. It was a gruesome sight. She lunged toward me, but the officer held her back. She hissed at me. She said, "I will sue you. I will take this house. The will gives me residency. You can't kick me out." I stepped closer to her. I wanted her to hear this. I wanted her to understand exactly how badly she had miscalculated. I said, "Actually, Beatrix, the will is very specific. It grants you residency on the condition of good behavior and respect for the estate. Breaking and entering is a felony. Destruction of property is a felony. Assault with a deadly weapon is a felony. By attacking me and destroying my home, you have violated the terms of the codicil. You have voided your own rights." Her eyes went wide. The realization hit her harder than the police ram had hit the door. She had not just lost the imaginary $2 million. She had lost the cottage. She had lost the stipend. She had lost everything. I continued. I said, Arthur Vance is going to have a field day with this. You are not going back to the guest cottage, Beatrix. You are going to a holding cell. And when you get out, you will be homeless, and you will have a criminal record that will ensure you never work as a private nurse for a wealthy old man ever again. She stared at me. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The fight drained out of her. She slumped against the officer, a dead weight of defeat. They led her out the front door. I watched her go. I watched her red soles scrape against the marble floor one last time. I watched them guide her into the back of the patrol car. I saw her head bow as the door slammed shut. The young officer stayed behind to take my statement. He took pictures of the clock. He took pictures of the crowbar. He took the recording from my phone as evidence. He was polite and efficient. He treated me with the deference due to a victim. He did not know that I was the architect of the trap. He only saw a grandmother who had survived a home invasion. When he finally left, it was almost dawn. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. The ticking was gone. The heartbeat of the house had stopped. I stood in the foyer alone. The air was cold coming in through the broken door. I looked at the grandfather clock. It was ruined. The wood was splintered beyond repair. The face was crushed. It was a tragedy. Elias had loved that clock. But as I looked at the wreckage, I felt a strange sense of peace. The clock had done its job. It had protected the secret, and it had caught the thief. It had sacrificed itself to save me. I walked to the kitchen and retrieved the flour jar. I dug my hand into the white powder and pulled out the plastic bag. I wiped it clean. I took out the black leather notebook. The real Galloway ledger. I held it in my hands. $2 million. A fortune built on lies and tax evasion. It was the reason for all of this. It was the reason Beatrix was in handcuffs and my clock was in pieces. I had won. The intruder was gone. The threat was neutralized. The house was mine again. But now I had to decide what to do with the prize. I opened the book and looked at the numbers one last time. They didn't look like wealth to me anymore. They looked like a burden. They looked like a chain that was still tying me to a husband who had betrayed me. I closed the book. I knew what I had to do. The audit was finished. It was time to close the account. I walked into the living room and knelt before the fireplace. The ashes from the last fire were cold and gray. I crumpled up some old newspaper and arranged the kindling. I struck a match and watched the flame catch. I was not going to spend my twilight years looking over my shoulder. I was not going to become like Elias, hiding secrets in the dark. I was Sylvia Thorne, and I was going to be free. The match flared to life in my hand. It was a small, fragile thing against the darkness of the room, but it burned with a fierce determination. I watched the orange flame lick the edge of the crumpled newspaper in the grate. The paper curled and blackened, and then the dry wood of the kindling caught. The fire crackled. It was a hungry sound. It demanded to be fed. I sat on the hearthrug with the Galloway ledger in my lap. The leather cover was warm from my hands. Inside this book was the culmination of my husband's secret life. It was the $2 million he had skimmed and hidden and lied for. It was the price of his soul. And for a brief, terrifying moment, I hesitated. $2 million. I could travel. I could buy a villa in France. I could donate it to a hospital. I could ensure that I never had to worry about a heating bill or a medical copay for the rest of my life. It was security. It was power. It was the very thing Beatrix Mercer had destroyed her life to try and seize. But then I remembered the look in Elias's eyes in those last few years. I had thought it was stress. I had thought it was age. But now I knew it was fear. He had been a prisoner of this book. He had spent his days looking over his shoulder and his nights wondering if the IRS or a business rival or a greedy mistress would find him out. The money had not made him free. It had made him a liar. It had made him vulnerable to a predator like Beatrix. If I kept this book, I would become him. I would have to learn how to hide assets. I would have to lie to the taxman. I would have to jump every time the doorbell rang. I would have to live with the constant gnawing anxiety that someone knew my secret. I had spent 40 years of my life fighting against people who hid the truth. I was an auditor. I believed in the ledger balancing. I believed in clean hands. I ripped the first page out of the notebook. It made a sharp tearing sound that echoed in the quiet room. I tossed it into the fire. The flames leaped up to meet it. The paper turned black, and then gray, and then it was gone. The routing number for the account in Zurich vanished into smoke. I ripped out the next page, and the next. It felt good. It felt like shedding a heavy winter coat on the first day of spring. With every page I burned, I felt the weight of Elias's betrayal lifting off my shoulders. I was not just destroying the evidence of his crime. I was destroying his hold on me. He had left me this money as a way to control me, or perhaps as a guilt offering. But I did not want it. I did not want his dirty money. I wanted my life back. I threw the leather cover into the fire last. It took longer to burn. It curled and hissed and smelled of tannins and smoke. I watched it until it was nothing but a shapeless lump of ash. The money was gone. The accounts were inaccessible without the codes. The secret was dead. I stood up and brushed the ash from my skirt. The fire was dying down now, returning the room to shadows. I walked to the kitchen. The house was cold. The broken window in the living room was letting in the night air, and the front door was boarded up with a piece of plywood the police had kindly found in the garage. My home was damaged. My antique clock was a pile of firewood. My grandmother's china was broken. But as I filled the kettle with water, I realized that the house felt different. The oppressive atmosphere was gone. The sense of being watched was gone. The ghost of Beatrix Mercer and her perfume and her entitlement had been exorcised. I made my tea. I used a plain white mug because the fancy ones were gone or dirty. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the sun come up over the garden. The light hit the trees first, turning the leaves to gold. Then it touched the roof of the guest cottage. It looked small and empty now. It was just a building. It was no longer a fortress for my enemy. I took a sip of the hot tea. It tasted better than any wine Elias had ever bought. The phone rang at 9 o'clock. It was Arthur Vance. He had heard the news. He was frantic. He was apologizing. He was talking about restraining orders and lawsuits and insurance claims. He sounded like a man who was terrified he was going to lose a client. I listened to him babble for a minute, and then I interrupted him. I said, "Arthur, stop. It is over. She is gone." He stammered. He said, "Yes, but the estate, Sylvia. The complexity. The scandal. We need to manage the fallout." I said, "There is no scandal, Arthur. There is just a break-in. A confused young woman made a mistake. That is all the papers need to know." He asked about the assets. He asked if Elias had left anything else. He asked if I had found anything in the house. I looked at the fireplace, where the ashes were already cold. I said no, Arthur. I found nothing. Elias left me this house and his pension, and that is all. The rest is just dust. There was a long silence on the line. I think he knew I was lying. Arthur was a smart man, but he was also a practical one. He knew that some truths were too expensive to keep. He said, "Very well, Sylvia. I will draw up the paperwork for the repairs." I hung up the phone. I walked into the hallway one last time. I looked at the spot where the grandfather clock had stood for 30 years. The floor was bare. The wall looked empty. I would have to buy a new clock. Not a grandfather clock. Maybe something smaller. Something modern. Something that didn't tick so loudly. Something that belonged to me and only me. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp and clean. A neighbor was walking her dog. She waved at me. I waved back. I was 68 years old. I was a widow. I was alone. But I was not afraid. I had faced the thief, and I had faced the past, and I had won. I took a deep breath. The audit was closed, the books were balanced, and for the first time in a long time, the bottom line was peace. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. If you found $2 million of dirty money hidden in your husband's clock, would you have kept it, or would you have burned it like I did? Is peace of mind worth more than a fortune? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.